3 in the morning, 42 floors above the East River, and Cassius Marchetti hadn't moved a muscle in almost 4 hours. He couldn't. There was a woman asleep against his chest. She was still in the gray sweater she'd worn to work, worn clean through at both elbows, her hair spilled loose across his shirt, one hand curled up near his collar. She'd gone under so deep she didn't have the faintest idea who she was lying on, and the most feared man in Brooklyn sat propped against the headboard with his arm around her, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, absolutely terrified of waking her up. Nobody had ever lasted a full night in that room. 6 women had tried before her, every one of them trained, every one of them paid well, and every one of them walked out before sunrise. Not one would say a word afterward about what happened up there. The papers called Cassius Marchetti a real estate investor, 34 years old, gray-eyed, a faded scar along his collarbone, a plain gold ring that used to be his father's. Everybody in that city knew better than to say out loud what he really was. He owned half a shipping line and more buildings than he bothered counting. And there was exactly one thing on this earth his money had never once been able to buy him. Then, on a Tuesday in October, they sent up a new night caregiver. She was 27 years old, a former hotel maid wearing wool socks somebody had knitted by hand, with working hands cracked open from cleaning chemicals, and had no idea what kind of man was sleeping in that bed. She'd been awake 26 hours. She sat down because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, in the dark, she did the one thing nobody had ever dared to do in that room. She fell asleep. What Cassius Marchetti did when he found her there is the reason you're going to want to hear this whole story. If you love stories about ordinary people who turn out stronger than anybody expected, hit that like button for us. Share this one with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Now let's go back to the night it all began. That night began in a place several miles from the room on the 42nd floor, deep in the basement of the Ashcroft Hotel, where there were no windows, and the fluorescent light overhead flickered steadily like a broken clock. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Noelle Draper had just finished her night shift and was still carrying her faded cloth bag when she was called back to the personnel office. 4 people were already waiting inside. The night manager, 2 security guards blocking the door, and a young woman from the front desk who had shared morning shifts with Noelle through an entire winter. No one greeted her. The manager pointed to the table in the middle of the room, his voice as gentle as though he were inviting her to sit down for tea, and told her to place her bag on it. The guest in room 312 had reported a missing watch. Her shift, her floor. Noelle stood perfectly still for several seconds. Then she placed the bag on the table, opened it herself, and turned it upside down. Everything that made up her life spilled across the wooden surface, in front of the people she had worked beside for 3 years. A clean plastic lunch container, a half-empty bottle of water, several pairs of spare rubber gloves, a wallet so thin it couldn't even hold the crease when folded, a nearly empty jar of hand ointment, and a worn, hardbound notebook with frayed corners, something she had carried with her since her school days. The only object on that table that didn't belong to the life of a cleaning woman. The manager picked up the notebook, leafed through several pages, saw nothing but lines of small handwriting recording times and schedules, then set it down. One of the 2 guards turned the lunch container over. The young woman from the front desk stared at the floor from beginning to end, and didn't look up even once. They searched the bag. They searched her locker in the staff changing room. They even searched the supply cart she had returned to storage half an hour earlier. There was nothing. Noelle stood there waiting for an apology, or at least a few words to bring the matter to an end. But the manager merely clasped his hands behind his back, released a long breath, and told her that perhaps she should leave. He didn't use the word fired. He said the hotel didn't want to make a larger issue of it, that bringing the police in would create trouble for everyone, that she should simply leave quietly so everyone could preserve their dignity. It took Noelle a moment to understand whom he was being kind to. Calling the police would mean admitting that there was a thief among the hotel staff. It would mean opening a case, filing a report, and reimbursing that guest for the full value of the watch. But dismissing a cleaning woman wouldn't cost anyone a single dollar. The cheapest price was always paid by the person worth the least in their eyes. She asked about the hallway cameras. The manager said the system on that floor had malfunctioned that night, his voice flat and steady, without looking away and without even bothering to pretend he was surprised. And Noelle understood that there would never be a single piece of paper recording what had happened. No formal accusation, no incident report, not one line in any legal record anywhere in the world. There would only be an internal note in the personnel system used by the city's hotel industry, a line she would never be allowed to read, never be permitted to challenge, and never be able to erase. They had destroyed her without needing a single piece of paper. She gathered her belongings one by one and placed them back inside the bag, slowly, without trembling. Then she lifted her head and looked directly at the manager. For 3 years, she had cleaned those rooms without missing a single shift, without taking one day off, not even during the winter when she had gone to work with both hands split open from the chemicals. Yet the moment a wealthy guest lost something, she was the first person they suspected. She asked whether it was because she wore the cheapest shoes in the entire building. No one answered. She zipped the bag closed, walked past the 2 security guards, and stepped through the rear door into the cold of Brooklyn at 2 o'clock on an October morning, never knowing that this was the very night that would drive her toward that room on the 42nd floor. At 7 o'clock that morning, after walking nearly the entire way because she no longer wanted to spend money on train fare, Noelle pushed open the glass door of the Winslow Rehabilitation Center and stepped into the familiar smell of disinfectant mingled with weak coffee. Ellis was sitting up in bed with his back against a stack of pillows, 19 years old and visibly thinner than he had been that summer. He was watching a video lesson on how to teach himself computer programming on a phone with a cracked screen, and he turned it off the moment he saw his sister walk in exactly the way a younger brother hides the one thing he is clinging to so he doesn't lose his mind. He hadn't felt anything below his waist since the night a car struck him at the corner and sped away into the darkness, without stopping, without showing brake lights, without leaving a single witness who had managed to record the license plate. One doctor came in, then another followed, and eventually someone sat down with the brother and sister and told them about the Halloran program. It was their only real chance. A neurological rehabilitation protocol that accepted very few patients during each admission period. Some of those who were accepted managed to stand and walk again, while others didn't, but at least they were given a chance. The problem was that the waiting list was longer than the time Ellis's nervous system would remain responsive. The doctor said those words very softly, like a person who had been forced to say them many times before. Once that threshold had passed, it wouldn't matter whether Ellis continued his therapy or stopped, and what left Noelle numb wasn't the deadline, but the answer to the question that escaped her lips immediately afterward. She asked how much it would cost to buy him a place. The doctor looked at her, hesitated slightly, then said it wasn't a matter of money. Places were decided by the hospital board, and some of the people sitting on that board were there for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. She could borrow from 100 places and sell things she had never imagined selling, and she still wouldn't be able to buy a name onto that list. It was the first time in Noelle's life that she understood there were doors money couldn't open, and those were the doors that remained locked most tightly. She sat down on the edge of her brother's bed and thought about their mother. Colleen Draper had spent 20 years working as a home hospice nurse for people approaching the end of their lives. She went from one house to another, sat through the night beside the beds of strangers, washed their faces, held their hands, and sang to them when they couldn't sleep. She had recognized the signs of illness in her own body long before she sought help. She kept postponing her medical appointment, time after time, because missing one day meant losing one day's wages, and because her 2 children were still in school. By the time she finally agreed to go, the doctors could measure the time she had left only in months. A woman who had spent her entire life caring for others died because there was no one to care for her. Ellis looked at his sister and said the words he had kept locked inside his chest for weeks. He told her to leave, to stop herself from drowning with him. Noelle straightened the blanket over his knees, in the place where he couldn't feel her touch, then told him their mother had never let go of anyone, and she had no intention of becoming the first person in their family to do it. The next 3 weeks passed quickly and cruelly. She submitted applications to 8 hotels across the city. Some called her back, and some scheduled interviews, but every time, after they searched the hotel industry's personnel system, everything fell silent. No one gave her a reason. There was nothing she could challenge. That invisible note reached every place before she did. She found a night shift at a neighborhood diner, washing dishes from 10 o'clock at night until morning. Her already cracked hands split open even further, and a full week's wages didn't amount to half of the bill Winslow sent each month. She sold her old laptop. She sold her earrings. Then, one afternoon, she sat for a very long time inside the pawn shop on the corner, turning her mother's wedding ring over and over in her palm, the only thing Colleen had left behind, and finally pushed it beneath the glass. The man behind the counter offered her a price she didn't have the heart to bargain over. She took the money, walked out of the shop, and stood on the sidewalk for exactly 1 minute so she could breathe. She didn't cry. She had run out of time for that. The call came late one afternoon from a number with no name attached to it, and the man on the other end spoke with such careful politeness that Noelle nearly hung up, thinking it was a scam. He told her there was a job and instructed her to come to the diner at the corner of 5th Avenue and 43rd Street in Sunset Park at 4 o'clock in the morning, after her dishwashing shift. He knew which shift she worked. That detail should have frightened her, but the past 3 weeks had worn away every place inside her where fear might still have lived. At 4 o'clock in the morning, only 2 tables in the diner were occupied. Desmond Payne sat in the farthest corner, wearing a dark overcoat, with an untouched cup of coffee before him. He rose when she entered, in the manner of a man who had been taught proper courtesy somewhere very far from this diner. He appeared to be in his late 40s, with neatly combed hair and a voice so pleasant that people couldn't remember his face after walking away. He slid a thin set of papers across the table. It was a contract for overnight care in a private residence, arranged through a private healthcare company Noelle had never heard of, the kind of company without a sign outside and that didn't accept clients over the telephone. The client was a man who had suffered from chronic insomnia for many years. Her duties would include remaining in his room from after sunset until dawn, observing him and keeping written records, responding when he experienced an episode, and remaining silent about everything she saw. Noelle asked why he had chosen her. Payne said she had completed 3 years of nursing school before being forced to leave, that her first aid certification was still valid, and that she had spent night after night sitting beside a sickbed for months of her life, something no official record mentioned but that could still be discovered. Then he added that the list of candidates had grown steadily shorter, as 6 people had accepted the position before her, and all 6 had left. Noelle asked why they had quit. Payne fell silent for a moment, turning his coffee cup on its saucer, then replied that it was because of the episodes at 3 o'clock in the morning. He explained that the client was a large, powerful man, and when he awakened in the middle of an episode, he didn't know where he was, didn't recognize the person standing before him, and for those first few seconds, he was no longer the man they had seen earlier that evening. No one had been harmed. Payne made that perfectly clear. Not a single hair on anyone's head had been touched, but witnessing it inside a locked room was different. And there was a second reason. After their first night, all 6 people had discovered whose house they were in. Payne didn't say the name. He only said that in this city there were certain names people didn't speak aloud, and they had recognized one of those names while walking through the halls. The next morning, they resigned. None of them asked for another $1, and none of them ever repeated a single word about what they had seen. Noelle sat without moving. She thought about the bill Winslow sent every month, about her bare finger after that afternoon at the pawn shop, and about what the doctor had said concerning the time Ellis's nervous system would remain responsive. Then she asked how much the position paid. Payne began with a figure, and it was a fair one, the kind offered by a man who knew he was trying to purchase something difficult to obtain. Noelle shook her head. She took the paper from the rehabilitation center out of her bag, smoothed it flat against the plastic tabletop, and read aloud the exact amount printed on the final line. Not $1 more. Payne paused. He looked at her longer than necessary, and in that moment, the smooth surface of his polished courtesy shifted slightly, revealing something close to genuine curiosity. Every one of the 6 people before her had negotiated for more. No one had ever sat across from him and named a price lower than the one he had offered. He asked her why. Noelle told him she wouldn't take more than what she lacked. She needed enough, sir. Enough was a very specific number. Payne took out his pen, changed the amount written in the contract, and pushed it across the table for her signature. The car arrived to collect her precisely at sunset on that Tuesday in October, and the driver didn't say a single word throughout the journey. The building stood at the very edge of the river, and rose so high that Noelle had to lean down inside the car to see its summit, and they didn't enter through the main lobby. The car drove directly into the basement and stopped before a private elevator with no buttons, only a small glass panel for scanning a card. The elevator climbed smoothly for a very long time, so smoothly that she couldn't feel herself moving, and in that silence Noelle looked down at her hands, both of them cracked from chemicals, hands she had covered with ointment 3 times that day so they wouldn't look quite so bad. The doors opened onto an entrance hall paved in dark stone, where a woman named Bernadette Lang was already waiting. She appeared to be in her late 60s, with her hair pinned neatly into a bun, and her back held as straight as someone who had spent an entire lifetime standing inside houses she didn't own. She looked Noelle over from head to toe without trying to hide it. The practiced gaze of a woman who could judge another person in 3 seconds. Then she handed her a neatly folded set of clothes, a pale gray caregiver's uniform made of new fabric, with its freshly pressed creases still intact. Noelle took it, looked at it for a moment, then handed it back. She said she was accustomed to wearing what she had on. It was a worn gray sweater with holes at both elbows and a pair of wool socks her mother had knitted during the last winter of her life. Bernadette raised an eyebrow, and Noelle added that she had come to work, ma'am, not to be put on display. Bernadette didn't answer immediately. She studied Noelle longer than necessary, a little longer than she had during that first assessing glance, and for an instant, something passed across her face, before disappearing just as quickly. She only said that Noelle wasn't like the others, then turned and led her down the corridor. As they walked, she recited 3 rules in an even, uninflected voice, the voice of someone who had memorized them and had already repeated them to the 6 people who came before. First, she mustn't open the curtains for any reason, even after daylight came. Second, she mustn't touch him while he was sleeping. Third, and Bernadette stopped in the middle of the corridor as she said this, if Noelle heard anything at around 3 o'clock in the morning, she mustn't call anyone. The walls here were thick, and no one would come. Noelle asked what she should do if he needed help. Bernadette replied that helping him was her job, that it was the reason she was being paid, then opened a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor, stepped aside, and didn't enter. The door closed behind Noelle with a very soft click. The room was so large that even the sound of her breathing seemed different. Curtains stretched from ceiling to floor, thick and heavy, allowing only a narrow line of light to slip through beneath them. A large bed stood in the center, its covers perfectly smooth, as though no one had ever lain there. An armchair had been placed beside the window, facing into the room instead of looking outside, and Noelle immediately understood that it was meant for the person keeping watch. She placed her bag at the foot of the chair, sat down, and took out her hardbound notebook with its worn corners. She opened to a fresh page, wrote the date, then recorded the time her shift began. Her handwriting was small and orderly, a habit left over from 3 years spent in lecture halls. Then she sat there in the darkness and waited. The clock on the wall had no second hand, so the room was silent in a way that made her uneasy, the silence of a place that was very wealthy and very empty. She had been awake for 26 hours. Her legs ached dully from her ankles all the way to her hips after the dishwashing shift and the long walk that morning. Without realizing when it began, she started humming a melody very softly, an old song she hadn't thought about at all before it escaped her lips, humming only to make the room feel less empty, to place something faintly warm inside that stillness. She had hummed only a few notes when her neck began to feel heavy. She told herself she would close her eyes for just a moment, only until she heard footsteps in the corridor. The notebook slipped from her hands and came to rest across her lap, and sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning, Noelle Draper's eyes closed completely. Cassius Marchetti arrived home sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, and he had endured a day he didn't want to remember. He removed his coat and handed it to one of his men in the entrance hall, walked down the dark corridor, and opened the heavy wooden door at the end, with a movement so familiar that his hand performed it without waiting for his mind. He stopped at the threshold. Someone was inside his room. During the first second and a half, what moved through his mind wasn't surprise, but a list. Who had let her in? Who had carried an elevator card tonight? Whether the windows on this floor could be opened from outside? What she had inside her bag? It was the list that had raced through his mind for the past 14 years whenever anything wasn't exactly where it belonged, and it moved so quickly that he couldn't stop it. Then he heard her breathing. Slow, steady, deep. It wasn't the breathing of someone pretending to sleep. It wasn't the breathing of someone who had just drifted off from exhaustion and would start awake after a few minutes. It was the breathing of a person who had fallen all the way to the deepest reaches of sleep and had no vigilance left to protect herself. He stood there in the darkness for a long time, and he realized something that unsettled him even more than her presence. This woman was sleeping in his room without being afraid of him. It wasn't because she was brave. It was because she was so exhausted that even fear didn't have enough strength to wake her. He had seen that weariness on the faces of the men who worked down at the docks, the kind of exhaustion that gathered over many months, not over a single night. Instinct told him to call Bernadette upstairs, send the woman down in the elevator, and have someone determine what had happened in the morning. He didn't do it. He couldn't even explain to himself why he didn't. He walked closer, picked up the notebook that had slipped toward the edge of the chair, placed it on the small table, then slipped his arms beneath her and lifted her. She was lighter than he had expected. She didn't wake. She merely tilted her head gently toward his shoulder like a child, and he laid her on the far side of the bed, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. Then he sat on the other side, his back against the headboard, and remained awake. He was always awake. Over the past 14 years, he had learned how to survive the night without sleep, how to divide it into pieces, and kill each one with documents, with telephone calls to Europe during the hours when people there were working, or by standing at the window and watching the dark water below. That night, he did none of those things. He simply sat and listened to a stranger breathing steadily on the other side of the bed. He didn't know when he fell asleep. He only knew that he awakened in the middle of it. He didn't truly awaken. He was thrown out of sleep, his heart pounding wildly inside his chest, cold sweat running down his spine. And the worst part was always those first few seconds, when he didn't know where he was, didn't know what year it was, and his body had already prepared itself for something that had happened a very long time ago. He jerked upright, his breath hissing through his teeth, both hands clutching the blanket. In the darkness, he didn't recognize his own room. Then a hand came to rest in the center of his chest. It didn't seize him. It didn't shake him. It didn't hold him down. It simply rested there, flat and warm, directly over his beating heart, with just enough weight to tell a man where he was and that someone was beside him. Then came the sound of humming, very soft, suspended somewhere between sleep and waking. The same old melody she had sung for the empty room earlier that night. She didn't say a single word. She wasn't fully awake. It was something her body did without involving her mind, a reflex formed during the final 4 months she had spent beside her mother's bed. Through the nights when Colleen couldn't sleep, and every word of comfort had become meaningless, when Noelle learned that she shouldn't say anything at all, that she only needed to place her hand there and sing. Cassius's heartbeat slowed. He didn't understand why. He only knew that the part of him that was always braced for something terrible to happen, the part that hadn't relaxed even once in 14 years, suddenly released its grip that night. He lay down again. He didn't dare move because he was afraid her hand would leave him. He stared up at the dark ceiling and listened as the melody gradually softened, then faded completely when she slipped back into sleep, and the man whose true name the entire city was afraid to speak closed his eyes in his own room, for the first time in 14 years, without having to count anything at all. Noelle awoke because of the light, and the first thought that crossed her mind was that she had fallen asleep somewhere and was going to be late for her shift. She sat upright before she had time to remember where she was. The blanket slipped from her shoulders. She was lying in a bed she had never intended to touch, inside a room where she was being paid to keep watch, not to sleep. And a man sat in the armchair beside the window, facing her. The curtains were still closed, with only a thin band of light entering beneath them, just enough for her to see him. He sat perfectly still, his elbows resting on his knees, and he had been sitting that way for some time. Gray eyes, a shirt wrinkled across the shoulders, a faint scar running along his collarbone, and a plain gold ring without ornament on the hand hanging loosely before him. He didn't say anything. He simply watched her with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem in which every number was correct, yet the answer couldn't possibly be real. Noelle climbed out of bed so quickly that she nearly tripped over the leg of the table. She said she was sorry. She said she had fallen asleep. She said it had never happened before, not even once, not even during the nights when she had sat awake without interruption until morning, and that she knew she had just ruined the job she needed more than anything else in the world. She bent down to retrieve her notebook from the small table, her hands trembling slightly, and she was about to add that she wouldn't accept payment for the night when he interrupted her. He asked whether she remembered what had happened at around 3 o'clock in the morning. Noelle looked up. She genuinely tried to remember. She recalled sitting in the chair. She remembered writing down the date and the time her shift began. She remembered the room being so silent that it made her uncomfortable and humming a little tune to make it feel less empty. After that, there was nothing. Not a single fragment remained until the light awakened her in this bed. She shook her head and told him honestly that she didn't remember anything. Something passed across his face when he heard her answer, so quickly that it vanished almost at once. Cassius didn't ask again. He didn't tell her that he had awakened in that familiar place of darkness and hadn't known where he was. He didn't tell her that a hand had come to rest in the center of his chest and kept him on this side of it. He watched her standing there, holding the notebook against her chest like a schoolgirl waiting to be punished, and he kept all of it to himself, because he had just understood something. If she didn't remember, then she hadn't done it intentionally. It hadn't been a skill, a professional lesson, or something another person had instructed her to do. It meant that this woman's body, while she was deeply asleep, had instinctively reached toward a panicked stranger and done something it had learned to do somewhere else, many times, a very long time ago, and he didn't yet want to know where that place had been. He stood. In the dim light, she finally saw how tall he was, and she instinctively stepped back half a pace. He stopped at a careful distance from her, noticed that retreat, and didn't come any closer. He told her that the night before had been the first night he had closed his eyes without having to count. Noelle didn't understand. He continued in a calm voice, without the slightest trace of self-pity, saying that for 14 years he had survived every night by dividing it into pieces and counting until each one was gone. He told her that many people far more capable than she was, people with far more formal training, had sat in that very chair and hadn't managed to do what she had done while she was sleeping. Then he said that he needed to know why. Noelle remained still, her hands tightening around the notebook. Outside, the sun had already risen over the river, but the curtains remained closed, and inside this room, morning still hadn't come. They ate breakfast in a small room overlooking the river, and Noelle had already walked halfway down the corridor before she realized the table was being set for 2 people, not 1. Bernadette placed a plate before her without saying anything, pausing only a little longer than necessary before withdrawing. Cassius poured Noelle's coffee before pouring his own, and she didn't know how she was supposed to interpret that small detail. He came directly to the point. He wanted her to stay, not for 1 more night, but permanently. Her official title would be private housekeeper, though her real work would be keeping watch at night, and he would pay her by the week rather than by the night. He also made it clear that he wasn't offering this out of kindness, and she mustn't mistake it for that. Noelle asked him why it was sleep. She asked in a perfectly ordinary way, with the voice of someone who had spent 3 years in lecture halls and knew that if she wanted to treat something, she first had to understand its cause. Cassius set down his coffee cup. He didn't answer immediately. He looked out over the river for a while, and when he finally spoke, there was nothing sorrowful in his voice. It was merely flat in a way that made her uneasy. The flatness of a man who had repeated this story inside his own mind too many times. He said that when he was not yet 20, he had been sitting with his father inside a car parked outside a restaurant in Bensonhurst. A light rain was falling. His father had been talking to him about his education, about wanting him to leave the city, and he had been halfway through a sentence. Then he stopped speaking. Cassius ended the story there. He didn't tell her anything more. He didn't say what had happened, who had done it, or what came afterward. He only said that from that evening forward, every time he closed his eyes, he returned to the exact second before that sentence was left unfinished, while his body continued preparing itself for something that had happened a very long time ago, night after night. For 14 years without rest, Noelle remained silent. She didn't offer him words of sympathy. She had sat beside enough grieving people to know that such words didn't help, and that people mostly said them to soothe themselves. She only asked whether he took medication, what kind he used, and how long he had been taking it. He listed them for her. She nodded and said that when those medications were used for too long, the body grew accustomed to them, so the dose had to be increased, and eventually it was no longer medicine that helped a person sleep. It became nothing more than a way to knock oneself unconscious. Cassius looked at her. It was the first time during their conversation that someone had said something he hadn't anticipated. He asked whether she would accept the position. Noelle placed both hands on the table, the cracked hands she had stopped trying to hide that morning, and said she had 2 conditions. He told her to name them. First, she was an employee, not an object inside his house. What she wore, what she ate, and how she kept her own hours after her shift were her concern, and no one would rearrange who she was to make her more pleasing to someone else's eyes. Second, his people had to speak to her with respect. She was poor, and she said those words without the slightest hesitation. But being poor didn't mean being cheap. Cassius was silent for several seconds. Then he said that both conditions were accepted, speaking with the voice of a man who had just closed a door rather than made a promise. He added that if anyone in the house forgot the second condition, she should tell him. Once would be enough. Noel was about to question him when someone knocked at the door, and a man entered carrying a thin file for Cassius. He glanced through it without any change in his expression, then closed it. He told her that someone would take her home that afternoon to collect her belongings, and that her room was at the end of the west corridor, not in the staff quarters. When she stood to leave, he called her back and asked one final question in a voice that made it sound almost incidental. He asked what song she had been humming the night before. Noel thought for a moment, then said she wasn't certain. It was a very old song she had heard when she was a child, and she had never known its name. Cassius nodded, and he didn't ask anything else. It happened at the end of the second week after Noel moved into the room at the far end of the west corridor. That afternoon, Bernadette asked her to carry a tray of coffee down to the large study, and as Noel approached, she heard voices inside, many of them, though no one was speaking loudly. The door stood open by the width of a hand. She was about to knock when she stopped, because what came through that narrow opening wasn't the sound of an argument, but a silence with weight in it, the kind of silence that told a person not to enter. 7 or 8 men stood along the walls of the room, and in the center was a young man who couldn't have been much older than 20, his hands folded before his stomach like a student called to the front of the classroom. Cassius sat behind the desk. He didn't rise, roll up his sleeves, or make any of the movements Noel had seen men make before losing their tempers. He was simply listening. The young man said he hadn't known, that someone had told him to sign for it, so he had signed, and that he had believed the shipment had already been inspected. Someone in the room stated the amount of the loss, and Noel couldn't hear the figure clearly, but she saw the 2 men closest to the door shift their weight. The entire room was waiting. They were waiting for Cassius to strike the desk, waiting for him to shout, waiting for the thing that men in that world always expected and had grown accustomed to seeing. Cassius did nothing. He closed the file before him, pushed it aside, then spoke in a voice so quiet that Noel had to hold her breath to hear him through the opening. He said, "You came here when you were 21 years old." He said, "I gave you a name for people to call, a place to stand so they would know whose man you were, and a car." He said, "Now you will return all 3 to me." Then, in the final sentence, he said, "Beginning tomorrow morning, no one in this city will owe you anything, and no one will stand behind you anymore." 4 sentences, not one word of threat. No one touched him. The young man remained there for several more seconds, and Noel watched the color drain from his face, not because he was in pain, but because he understood. He stepped forward half a pace, and began to say, "Please, sir," but his voice broke before he could finish, and he dropped to his knees in the middle of the carpet. Cassius didn't look at him. He reached for another file, opened it, and began to read. No one in the room moved. The 2 nearest men helped the young man to his feet and escorted him out through a side door, gently, almost kindly, and that was the detail that sent a chill down Noel's spine. They treated him with the kindness people showed someone who had just lost everything and had nothing left for anyone to take. She stepped away from the opening, the coffee tray tilting slightly in her hands, and realized that her heart was beating quickly. During the past 2 weeks, she had begun to forget something. She had started thinking of Cassius as a patient, as a man who couldn't sleep, as someone who had told her that if anyone forgot to treat her with respect, she only needed to tell him once. She had forgotten that this house wasn't held together by kindness. That evening, when she entered his room at the appointed time, he was standing beside the window with the curtains still closed, and he knew that she had seen everything. He asked what she thought. Noel placed her notebook on the small table and told him the truth. She said he had taken away a man's entire life with 4 sentences, without even needing to raise his voice. Cassius turned to look at her. He asked whether she knew where that shipment had been going, whose hands it would have passed through, and who would ultimately have paid the price if it had gotten through. He said the young man wasn't evil. He was merely lazy and had been fortunate for too long, and in that world, those 2 things together killed people faster than malice. Then he said something Noel would remember for many years afterward. He asked whether she wanted him to be merciful. Mercy had a price in this place, and he was never the one who paid it. He didn't sleep that night. He lay perfectly still with his eyes open, and Noel sat in the chair, awake as well. Noel began keeping serious records the following night, not because anyone told her to, but because it was the only way she knew to deal with something she didn't yet understand. In lecture halls, she had been taught that if she wanted to identify the cause of an illness, she had to record everything that happened around it, even the details that seemed entirely unrelated, because the connection was often hidden in the place one considered least meaningful. So every night, she opened the hardbound notebook with its worn corners, wrote the date at the top of the page, then recorded the time Cassius entered the room, the time he lay down, the moment his breathing changed, the time he awakened, how long the episode lasted, and whether he managed to lie down again afterward. She recorded what he ate for dinner, how many cups of coffee he drank after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and whether he had consumed alcohol. She noted whether he had traveled far that day, whether he had been forced to sit through long meetings, and which evenings he returned looking like a man who had just survived something difficult. And because it was a professional habit rather than any deliberate intention, she also recorded the people who came and went, who entered that floor, at what time, how long they remained, and which elevator they used. On one occasion, she wrote that Mr. Payne had arrived shortly before midnight and left 15 minutes later. On another, she recorded that 2 strangers had arrived together and that she didn't know their names. She wrote down everything in small, orderly handwriting, without commentary or judgment, exactly as she had been taught to keep medical records. No one had ever asked what she wrote in the notebook, and she had never imagined that one day someone would. After 3 weeks, the numbers began to speak. On the nights when Cassius came home early, ate a proper dinner, and didn't touch coffee during the afternoon, his episodes came later and ended sooner. On the nights following long meetings, they came earlier and struck harder. She began adjusting the small things within her control. She changed the tea he drank in the evening. She instructed the kitchen to stop serving coffee entirely after 4 o'clock, and endured the cook's disapproving stare for 2 full days. She turned off every cold light in the room and replaced them with an old table lamp placed in the far corner. She didn't position her chair close to the bed, but kept a careful distance, near enough for him to know someone was in the room, yet far enough that he wouldn't feel watched. By the end of the 4th week, the notebook contained a line that even she had to read twice. He slept for 6 uninterrupted hours. No episodes. The following morning, he came down for breakfast, and she noticed that the dark circles beneath his eyes had faded. He didn't mention it, and neither did she. But from that day forward, he began lingering at the breakfast table instead of picking up his coffee and leaving immediately. Emery Marchetti appeared on one such morning. He entered the dining room without knocking. A tall man with dark blonde hair swept back from his face, and he was already laughing in the corridor, the kind of laughter that belonged to someone accustomed to being welcomed everywhere he went. He was Cassius's cousin, and Noelle understood that before anyone had time to introduce him, because of the way he pulled out a chair and sat down. Then he noticed her. He looked at the plate before her, at her coffee cup, at her worn sweater, then turned toward Cassius, and remarked that the house had grown far too permissive lately, if even the maid was allowed to sit at the same table. He said it cheerfully, as though making a joke. The entire room fell silent. Noelle put down her fork but didn't rise, because she had promised herself on the night she left the Ashcroft Hotel that she would never again stand up because of words like those. Cassius didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike the table or change his expression. He simply set down his coffee cup, and the sound of porcelain touching wood rang clearly through the silence. He said that in this house, the person who cleaned the floors and the person who sat at the head of the table ate at the same table. Then he said that if his cousin found it too crowded, the door was still where it had always been. Emery laughed once more, but the sound fell into the middle of the room, and no one picked it up. He stood, patted Cassius on the shoulder, said something about returning later, and walked out. That night, Noelle recorded the time Emery arrived and the time he left the building. The truth came apart one afternoon when Noelle carried a file of medication receipts down to the study and found the door open by the same width of a hand as it had been that day. This time, only 2 people were inside, Cassius and Mr. Payne, and they were discussing rent that would be paid on someone's behalf, an apprenticeship at an automobile repair shop in Philadelphia, and the need to prepare the paperwork under a different name, because no one in the city would dare accept the old one anymore. Noelle heard the name of the young man who had knelt in the middle of the carpet that day. She stood frozen in the corridor with the file of receipts in her hands, and it took her a moment to understand that the man who had taken away that young man's entire life with 4 sentences was also the man quietly building him another life somewhere else. That evening, she confronted him directly. Cassius denied it. He said she had misheard. She told him she hadn't, and that she even remembered the name of the repair shop. He remained silent for a long time, then said that inside that room, he had been required to become the man who cast the young man out. If anyone learned about what came afterward, then it would no longer be kindness. It would become an opening, and people would reach into that opening until they tore the entire house apart. He told her never to mention it to anyone again, including him. 3 evenings later, he took her to dinner at a small restaurant in Carroll Gardens, and Noelle would always remember that the place was filled to capacity, with people waiting all the way out onto the sidewalk. Yet in the time it took them to remove their coats, a table in the farthest corner had somehow become available. No one brought them menus. Food simply appeared at the table, and when they rose to leave, there was no bill. The owner escorted them all the way to the door, bowed his head, and no one explained any of it to her. On the drive home, the car entered the battery tunnel at an hour when it was nearly empty, leaving only the sound of the engine striking the concrete walls and returning as something dense and heavy. Cassius was driving. Noelle sat beside him, halfway through a sentence about a message Ellis had just sent, when she saw 2 sets of headlights ahead suddenly change lanes and block the road. Everything that followed happened very quickly and in darkness. Cassius didn't slam on the brakes. He did the opposite. He released the accelerator and allowed the car to slow, while his right hand reached across and forced Noelle's shoulder down. She slid from the seat onto the floor, her knee striking the gear console, and she heard him say a single word, "Down." Then he leaned over and covered her with his body. She couldn't see anything after that. There was only darkness, the smell of the fabric of his coat, the scream of tires against the damp tunnel floor, a hard, sharp sound striking the glass on the left, followed by shattered glass falling onto the seat where she had been sitting only moments before. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could hear him breathing directly above her, slow and steady, impossibly calm for what was happening around them. He didn't panic for even a second. He turned the wheel and guided the car through the opening between the other 2 vehicles, along a path he must have calculated from the instant he saw the headlights change lanes. Then he pressed the accelerator, and the tunnel swallowed the sounds behind them. It had taken less than 1 minute. When he told her she could sit up, they had already left the tunnel and were crossing the bridge, with streetlights sweeping across the ceiling of the car in a steady rhythm. Noelle climbed back onto the seat, her hands trembling, and asked whether he was hurt. He said he wasn't. She looked at him. A section of the window on the left had shattered, allowing freezing air to pour inside, and the sleeve of his coat was torn in a long line from the elbow down. He continued driving. After several blocks, she noticed that he had shifted control of the wheel to his right hand while holding his left forearm rigidly across his lap, neither moving it nor changing its position for the rest of the journey. She said his name. He didn't answer. She said it louder and asked how long he intended to hide the injury from her. Cassius kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He said, "Until you fall asleep. If you stay awake, I stay awake." When they reached the house, she made him sit beneath the table lamp in the corner of the room and treated his forearm using exactly what she had learned during her 3 years in lecture halls, working silently and efficiently without asking another question. He sat still and allowed her to do it. That night, he slept for 4 hours, and in the notebook, beneath the line recording the time, Noelle added a brief note about the 2 sets of headlights that had changed lanes inside the battery tunnel, along with the hour, because that was her habit, recording everything that happened around an event, even the details that appeared to have no connection at all. Bernadette gave Noelle the room at the end of the east corridor to clean on a rainy afternoon, almost as if it were an incidental task, though she tried and failed to keep her voice calm. She said the room had been locked for years, that the master of the house hadn't allowed anyone inside, but recently he had told her to have it cleaned, and she didn't want to touch anything in there herself. Noelle accepted the key. The room was smaller than she had imagined, with a writing desk beside the window, a low bookcase, and a faded rug in the middle of the floor. Everything was covered in a thin, even layer of dust that looked like snow had fallen inside the house. It had once been Cassius's mother's study. Noelle opened the window to let in fresh air, tied back her hair, and began with the bookcase. She worked slowly and carefully, with the care of someone who understood that she was touching the belongings of a dead woman in someone else's home. In the second drawer of the writing desk, she found an old tin cookie box, the kind women of an earlier generation often used to store miscellaneous papers. Inside were several cards, an expense book, a few yellowed bills, and at the very bottom, several instant photographs, square pictures with thick white borders whose colors had faded to yellow. She turned through them without thinking. The third photograph stopped her hand. It showed a thin woman sitting in a wheelchair beside a window, a scarf wrapped around her head, smiling. Standing behind the wheelchair with both hands resting on its handles was a nurse wearing a pale blue coat. Noelle stared at the picture for a very long time. She studied the low bun, the slight tilt of the left shoulder, and the way both hands rested on the wheelchair handles with the thumbs folded inward. She had looked at those hands throughout her entire childhood. On the back of the photograph were several words in ballpoint pen, traced in the trembling handwriting of someone on a sickbed. There was only one line. "Today she sang to me, and I was able to sleep." There was no name. No name was needed. Noelle lowered herself onto the faded rug in the middle of the room with the photograph in her hand, and she remained there for a long time without crying, hearing only a ringing in her ears as the room seemed to close around her. Her mother had been inside this house. Her mother had walked through the same corridor Noelle walked every night. Her mother had sat beside a bed somewhere on this floor during the nights when the woman in the photograph couldn't sleep, and she had done what she had done for everyone she cared for throughout those 20 years. She hadn't said anything. She had placed her hand down, and she had sung. And the old melody Noelle had hummed in the darkness on her first night, the song whose name she couldn't remember and had believed she heard somewhere during childhood, had once echoed through this very house, long before she ever set foot inside it. She didn't hear his footsteps. Cassius stood at the threshold with one hand still resting against the doorframe, his eyes fixed on the photograph in her hand. He didn't ask any questions. He entered, sat on the edge of the writing desk, and extended his hand. Noelle placed the photograph in it. He looked at the image, then turned it over and read the trembling line on the back, while the room grew so silent that they could hear the rain tapping against the windowsill. He remained still for a long time. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said that he had also been in the house during that winter, that he still remembered nights when he had passed his mother's door and heard singing from inside, and that he had never thought to ask who it was. He said he had been too young then, and he had believed there would be many more nights like those. Noelle remained seated on the rug. Very softly, she told him that her mother had spent 20 years caring for people, moving from one house to another, and that when she came home, she rarely said much and never told her children what had happened inside those houses. Only now did Noelle understand why. Cassius placed the photograph on the desk beside the tin box and said something Noelle would never be able to forget. He said, "Your mother sang my mother to sleep. Then you sang me to sleep." He asked whether she believed in debts. He did, and now he owed a debt to 2 women, neither of whom he could repay. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall. Neither of them said anything more. The following week, Cassius called her down to the study in the morning and pushed a completed set of documents across the desk, needing only her signature. It was a medical caregiver authorization form. Signing it meant that from then on, she would have access to his complete medical records, permission to speak directly with his treating physician, and the authority to make decisions if he became unable to make them himself. He also gave her the code to the small safe in his bedroom, where he kept his medication and copies of his medical records, in case she needed to call a doctor in the middle of the night and he couldn't speak. Noelle read through the final page, then looked up and asked whether he was certain. She said she had only been there for a few months, and that people usually signed documents like these for a spouse or a close family member. Cassius said he didn't have a wife, and that his closest blood relative had recently told him the maid shouldn't be allowed to sit at the same table. He told her to sign. Dr. Genevieve Hart arrived on Friday afternoon, a woman in her late 50s with short silver hair, carrying a leather case worn at the corners. She spoke with Cassius for half an hour in the study, then came out and found Noelle in the corridor. She asked whether Noelle was the person who had just signed the authorization. Then she told her to sit down. She explained that because of that document, she was now permitted to tell Noelle what she was about to say. Years without sleep didn't merely leave a person tired. When the body couldn't rest, the heart had to work harder than it was built to endure, night after night, year after year, until eventually it began to fail in ways that couldn't be repaired. She showed Noelle several test results and pointed to the lines Noelle had once learned to read in lecture halls, and Noelle immediately understood what the doctor didn't say aloud. She asked how much time remained. Dr. Hart said that if Cassius continued sleeping as he had during the past several months, the deterioration might slow down, perhaps by a great deal. But if he returned to the way he had been before, she couldn't promise Noelle any amount of time at all. Then she took Noelle by the wrist and gave her one instruction, her voice becoming completely serious. "Don't tell him." She said she had treated this man for many years, and knew that if he learned his time was limited, he wouldn't rest for another minute. He would only do everything faster, and doing everything faster would mean dying sooner. Noelle asked the question she had carried inside herself for months. She asked why it had been her when 6 people with far better training had come before her. Dr. Hart remained silent for a moment, then explained that during the season when his mother was gravely ill, Cassius had still been in his teens, and he had refused to return to his own room to sleep. Every night, he sat in the corner of his mother's room beside the nurse, keeping watch. He slept sitting upright in that chair while a stranger breathed steadily beside the bed. She said the human body learned very quickly and forgot very slowly. His body had learned that the sound of someone breathing evenly nearby meant safety, that nothing terrible had happened yet that night. Then his mother died, and several years later his father died, and that reflex became buried beneath many other things. She looked at Noelle and said, "You aren't curing him. You're only reminding his body of something it once knew and then forgot." Cassius returned home late that evening. He had just come from an old restaurant in Bensonhurst, where he had spent more than 2 hours sitting across from 3 men, belonging to a family that the Marchettis had opposed for several decades. He had gone there to ask a single question, one that no one in his position had ever dared ask aloud. He asked the price of a way out. He wanted to know how much it would cost to surrender all his territory, withdraw from everything, retain only the transportation company and several buildings, and be left in peace. The man sitting in the middle laughed before answering. Then he named a figure so absurdly high that it was no longer a price. It was another answer spoken through numbers. Cassius neither accepted nor refused. He thanked them, stood, and left. But that same evening, before his car had even crossed the bridge, a telephone call was placed from the room behind the restaurant. The person who received it was Emery Marchetti. Emery Marchetti was waiting for her outside the Winslow Center on a Thursday afternoon, leaning against his car as though he had already been standing there for an hour, and he greeted her in the same cheerful voice he had used at the breakfast table. He said he hadn't come to trouble her and had only happened to be passing by. Then he recited Ellis's full name, his age, the name of his treating physician, and even the point beyond which his nervous system would no longer respond. Noelle stood perfectly still. Emery took an envelope from inside his coat but didn't offer it to her immediately. He simply held it in his hand. He said he held a seat on the board of the hospital that ran the Halloran program. He said a waiting list was arranged by human beings, and anything human beings arranged could be rearranged. Her brother could enter the next admission cycle, the very next one, and he said it as casually as someone offering another person a cup of tea. Then he told her the rest. He only needed Cassius's schedule. Where Cassius went, whom he met, at what time, which car he used, and which nights he slept, and which nights he didn't. That was all. No one would be harmed, he emphasized. After all, he was a member of the family. Noelle looked at the envelope in his hand, and in that exact moment, she saw her brother standing again, walking again, counting every step he took down the corridor of the rehabilitation center. She saw it so clearly that it hurt. Then she thought of her mother standing behind the wheelchair in the old photograph, both hands resting on the handles, her thumbs folded inward. She told Emery she wouldn't accept. Still smiling, he asked whether she understood what she had just refused. She told him she understood perfectly, and that was precisely why she was refusing it. Then she walked directly into the center, sat with Ellis for an hour, talked about the programming videos he had been watching, and didn't tell her brother a single word. When she returned home that evening, she didn't tell anyone else either. 3 days later came a perfectly ordinary evening, one Noelle would later remember more clearly than any other evening of her life. The head cook had the night off, Bernadette had gone to her daughter's house, and only 2 people remained on the entire floor. Noelle went down to the kitchen intending to make herself a bowl of noodles, and Cassius followed her. He stood in the doorway with both hands in his pockets, watching her take out a pot as though he were witnessing something deeply unfamiliar. She asked whether he knew how to cook. He said he could make one dish. That one dish turned out to be fried eggs, and he burned them. He stared at the pan with the solemn expression of a man examining a contract, then said that when he was young, he had once cooked the same dish for his mother. She had eaten every bite, and it wasn't until many years later that he understood she had finished it because she loved him, not because it tasted good. He continued telling her small stories like that while she stirred the noodles, stories about the time he skipped school to watch the ships at the harbor and his father caught him, and about how the ring he wore had once fallen into a storm drain, and he had spent an entire afternoon lying on the sidewalk trying to retrieve it. Noelle laughed. It was real laughter, a sound that escaped before she could stop it, and immediately afterward she realized how long it had been since she had laughed that way. Cassius fell silent. He looked at her as he had on that first morning, with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem whose answer couldn't possibly be real. They ate at the kitchen counter, 2 bowls, no dining table, with no one there to serve or clear anything away. Afterward, she washed the dishes while he stood beside her, drying them awkwardly, and at one point their hands touched over a wet bowl. Neither of them pulled away. She looked up. He lowered his head. The kiss was brief and restrained, almost cautious, the kind of kiss people shared when they knew they were crossing a boundary they could never step back across. Cassius was the one who stopped first. He retreated half a pace, set down the dish towel, and said that he had paid her to enter his house. He said it was the greatest regret of his life. Then he told her that from that day forward, she could leave whenever she wished. No one would stop her or question her, and her wages would still be paid in full. He only hoped that whenever he opened his eyes in the morning, she would still be there. That night, he slept without interruption until morning. The episode came 4 nights later, and it was the worst one Cassius had suffered since Noelle first entered the house. He came home late, ate nothing, and she had already written in her notebook that something had seemed wrong from the moment he walked through the corridor without greeting anyone. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, he jerked upright, and this time he didn't recognize her. She called his name twice, but he looked through her as though she weren't there, his breath hissing while his fingers gripped the edge of the bed so tightly that his knuckles turned white. She had learned that she mustn't touch him at such moments. She could only speak, steadily and slowly, and she did exactly that until he closed his eyes and collapsed back against the pillow, his body drenched in sweat and his heart pounding wildly beneath his shirt. She checked his pulse and didn't like the number she counted. She remembered the test results Dr. Hart had shown her and the warning the doctor had given, and she decided to call her that very night. But Dr. Hart would ask about his medication dosage, the most recent adjustment, and details recorded in the copies of his medical records. So Noelle approached the small safe set into the wall behind the closet door, the safe whose code Cassius had recited to her on the day she signed the authorization, and entered those numbers for the first time since he had entrusted them to her. The safe opened. Inside were boxes of medication, a set of medical records in a blue binder, a thick envelope filled with cash, and at the very bottom, another file with a brown cardboard cover and a label attached to its spine. Her family name was written on that label. Beside it was a date Noelle didn't need to examine closely, because it was a date she would carry for the rest of her life, the day someone had called her shortly before dawn to say that her brother was being taken into the emergency room. She stood frozen before the open safe as her hands slowly turned cold. She didn't remove the file. She only took out the blue medical binder, closed the safe, and stepped into the corridor to call Dr. Hart in a voice so calm that even Noelle found it strange. The following morning, after Cassius had awakened and was able to sit upright, she placed her overnight notebook on the table and asked him directly why something bearing the Draper name was inside his safe. Cassius remained silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood, walked to the safe, opened it, removed the brown file, and placed it on the table before her. He pushed it toward her. He didn't deny a single thing. He told her to open it and see for herself. Inside were photographs from the scene, a copy of an internal compensation statement, the identification numbers of a vehicle's frame and engine, the name of the driver, and that man was still working as Emery Marchetti's private driver. There was also a copy of the police report and the original document, and the 2 reports didn't match. Noelle turned through the pages one by one, and her hands trembled so badly that she could hear the paper shaking. Cassius spoke in the flattest voice he possessed. He said he hadn't been driving the car, hadn't known what happened on the night of the collision, and had only begun tracing it after seeing the Draper name on an internal payment document he couldn't forget. Then he told her the part that was hardest to hear. That was also why he had agreed to let her enter his house. He had kept her there to discover what she knew. He wanted to determine whether the woman carrying that name had been sent by someone else. He said it had taken him several weeks to understand that she knew nothing, that she was only trying to save her brother, and that was when he began losing sleep for an entirely different reason. Noelle listened to everything. She set down the file. Then she asked him a question he hadn't anticipated. She asked what else he was keeping. Cassius looked at her. Then he returned to the safe, took out a small memory card, and placed it on the table beside the file. He said his people had obtained the original security footage from the Ashcroft Hotel on the night the watch disappeared. The recording clearly showed who had placed it inside her supply cart. It was one of Emery's men. Cassius had possessed the recording for many weeks. He hadn't released it because doing so would have told Emery that he was being investigated, and Cassius still didn't have enough evidence to bring him down before the committee. The room fell silent. Noelle rose very slowly. She said that throughout all those days, he had known she hadn't stolen the watch. He had known while she stood washing dishes through the night, while she sold her mother's ring, while she applied to 8 different places and each one fell silent after searching the personnel system. She said he had claimed to respect her. Respect would have meant telling her on the very day he learned the truth. Cassius didn't stand. He said she was right, and that he had no answer with which to argue. Noelle removed the key to her room from the ring, placed it on the table between the file and the memory card, then walked out. He didn't call after her. That night, for the first time in many months, Cassius Marchetti didn't sleep for a single minute. Emery Marchetti didn't have to wait long. On the very morning Noelle left the building, he had someone prepare a funding commitment and send it to the Winslow Center under Noelle Draper's name, promising to cover the full cost of the Halloran program for the patient Ellis Draper. It was only a piece of paper. It didn't require anyone to acknowledge it, didn't require the patient's consent, and didn't require the signature of any family member, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. It only needed to exist. Then he had a copy delivered to Cassius's desk, accompanied by a record of time, stating clearly that on Thursday afternoon of the previous week, Miss Draper had been present in the Winslow Center parking lot with Mr. Emery Marchetti for approximately 15 minutes. Both things were true. Not a single word in either document had been fabricated. And when placed together, those two truths told a perfect lie. Cassius read the paper for approximately 30 seconds. He hadn't slept in 3 nights. He had just watched that woman place her key on the table and walk out the door, and he had spent the entire previous night wondering where he had gone wrong. Now, before him, was a private meeting she had never mentioned, and an enormous sum of money offered in her name, attached to the very thing that not even his entire fortune could purchase. During those 30 seconds, the man who hadn't trusted anyone in 14 years believed the worst. He didn't strike the table. He merely folded the paper, placed it down, and sat in silence for a very long time. And that same morning, inside a small cafe across the bridge, Desmond Payne sat opposite Emery Marchetti and signed an agreement he had spent many nights considering. He surrendered Cassius's schedule, the code to the private elevator, and even the locations of the family's warehouses. Emery asked whether he was certain. Desmond said he was, his voice as flat as the tabletop. What Emery knew and Cassius didn't was what had happened many years earlier, during the time when Desmond was still young and had a habit of remaining too long at drinking tables where he should never have sat. One evening, he had let something slip. He had revealed a very small detail, a schedule, the place where a particular car would be parked the following evening. And he had spoken without any malicious intention. A few days later, Cassius's father was gone. No one ever knew. There was no evidence, and no investigation ever reached that far. Desmond Payne spent all the years that followed standing behind the son, performing every task he was given, never asking for anything, never failing to appear, repaying a debt that only he knew he owed. Then Emery discovered the truth. He didn't buy Desmond with money. He merely placed what he knew on the table and waited. That afternoon, when everything was finished, Desmond said only one thing to Emery. He said, "Do you think today is the day I sold him? I sold myself a long time ago. Today is only the day someone came to collect the goods." Meanwhile, Noelle was sitting in Ellis's room at Winslow. She had spent almost the entire afternoon there, saying very little and merely listening as her brother told her about several lines of code he had managed to write. At nearly 7 o'clock that evening, a member of the center's staff entered and informed her that Ellis's records had just been updated, that a sponsor had come forward, and they showed her the document bearing her own name. Noelle read it and understood everything within seconds. She excused herself, went down to the parking lot, and found Emery Marchetti standing beside his car in the same place he had stood before. He was no longer smiling. He said he was very sorry that she had made the wrong choice the first time. He said the choice was much simpler now. Then he told her to get into the car. Noelle asked what would happen if she refused. Emery looked toward the center, where the light in Ellis's window was still burning, and said only that her brother would be transferred in the morning, and since he sat on the board, He knew exactly where they would send him. Then he opened the car door and waited. Noelle stared at the illuminated window for another moment. Then she got into the car. The warehouse stood at the water's edge in Red Hook. A low block of concrete where the wind blowing in from the bay made a hollow moaning sound throughout the night. Noelle was taken into a small room near the back, containing a table, a chair, a ceiling light, and an old clock on the wall, whose second hand could be heard moving with every tick. No one touched her. Someone even brought her a glass of water and placed it politely on the table before her, and that politeness frightened her more than anything else. Emery sat across from her, removed his coat, placed his telephone on the table, and said that he had already called Cassius. He had given Cassius 90 minutes. Within those 90 minutes, Cassius had to appear and sign the documents waiting inside Emery's leather case, documents transferring all operating authority, the transportation company, and the buildings into his cousin's name. Emery pointed toward the clock and said that after the time expired, he couldn't promise anything. Then he added a detail that clearly pleased him. He said he had deliberately waited until this particular week, because he knew Cassius hadn't slept for 3 nights. A man who hadn't slept for 3 nights no longer had steady hands or a sharp mind, and he would sign anything placed before him. Noelle remained silent. She watched the second hand moving around the clock. Then she asked him a question. She asked whether he remembered the morning at the breakfast table, when he had remarked that even the maid was allowed to sit with the family. Emery raised an eyebrow. Noelle said she had thought about those words for many nights. She told him he had spent his entire life standing behind other people. First behind his father, then behind a cousin younger than he was, and he had stood there for so long that he could no longer distinguish between wanting power and simply wanting to stop standing behind someone else. She said that to seize that seat, he had been forced to break a young man of 19 on his way home, plant a watch inside a cleaning woman's supply cart, offer a place in a medical program as something to barter, and now imprison a woman inside a warehouse to force his younger cousin to sign away everything. She told him that not one of those acts belonged to a strong man. Emery stopped smiling. He said she should be quiet. Noelle said one final thing, and she said it with complete calm. She told him that he believed he had won because he had captured the weakest person in the room, but the weakest person there wasn't her, Mr. Marchetti. Meanwhile, several miles away, Desmond Payne sat alone inside his car in an empty parking lot. He had been there since daylight. He had been present in the room on the afternoon when Emery arranged the offer of a place in the Halloran program, and apart from Emery and Noelle, he was the only person who knew she had refused. Throughout the week, he had watched Cassius live with the opposite belief, and he had said nothing. Now he picked up his telephone. He knew exactly what he was about to do. Speaking those 4 words would mean admitting that he had been in that room. It would end his agreement with Emery, and it would also end the long, silent effort at redemption he had pursued throughout all those years. He dialed the number. Cassius answered on the first ring. Desmond spoke 4 words. She didn't take it. Then he ended the call, removed the battery, threw the telephone and the battery into the dark water below, and remained inside the car with both hands resting on the steering wheel. At the other end of the call, Cassius stood frozen in the middle of his study. Those 4 words destroyed everything he had believed during the past 3 days, while at the same time returning what he had thought he had lost. He didn't need to ask which warehouse. The Red Hook warehouse belonged to the family, and he knew every door inside it. He reached for his coat. He didn't call anyone else. On the wall of the small room in Red Hook, the second hand continued moving, and more than half of the 90 minutes had already passed. He arrived with less than 20 minutes remaining on the wall clock. They heard a car stop outside. Then the large warehouse door rolled open, and Cassius Marchetti walked in alone, with both hands raised to shoulder height, his coat hanging open so everyone could see that he was carrying nothing. There was no second car. None of his men waited outside. 4 of Emery's men spread out beneath the industrial light, and they glanced at one another because this wasn't what they had been prepared to confront. Emery emerged from the small room, pulling Noelle out with him, and he laughed when he saw those raised hands. He said that someone had finally learned to be reasonable. He opened the leather case, removed the documents, placed them on a wooden crate in the middle of the floor, and laid a pen on top. Cassius didn't look at the papers. He looked at Noelle, only briefly, long enough to see that she was unharmed, then turned his eyes back to his cousin. He lowered his hands and reached inside his coat, causing all 4 men to move at once. He withdrew a file with a brown cardboard cover. He placed it beside the documents on the wooden crate and said that before anyone signed anything, everyone in the warehouse should read what was inside. It contained the frame and engine serial numbers of a car still sitting in the family garage, the name of the person who had driven it on the night of the collision at the street corner, and both the original report from the scene and the altered version, placed side by side. Cassius spoke the driver's name clearly, then added that the same man had served as Emery Marchetti's private driver ever since, still collecting his wages and moving freely through the city as though nothing had happened. He said the victim had been a young man of 19 on his way home. Then Cassius took out a second file, thinner than the first, and placed it on top. It contained a record of transfers made from Emery's account during the past 3 months, and one of the recipients' names appeared on the very first line. Cassius didn't read that name aloud. He only said that someone within the family had been bought, that he had learned this tonight and hadn't known before, and that he wouldn't speak that person's name inside the warehouse. Emery's 4 men began looking down at the papers on the wooden crate. Cassius continued without raising his voice. He said that every man standing in the warehouse had a home, a mother, a younger sibling, someone who walked home alone at night. He asked where they would be standing in that warehouse if the car had struck someone they loved and driven away, while a member of this family paid to make the report disappear. No one answered, but the man standing closest to Noel took 1 step away from his position and moved aside. Then a second man did the same. Emery turned sharply and called both men by name, and for the first time that evening, a crack appeared in his voice. No one moved toward him. Cassius picked up the pen resting on the transfer documents, turned it between his fingers, then placed it down again. He told his cousin that Emery had possessed her for 90 minutes. Cassius would possess Emery's name for the rest of his life. He told him to choose. Emery looked around his own warehouse and realized it no longer belonged to him. He didn't shout. He simply stood with one hand still resting on the leather case, and in the silence, they could hear the water striking the embankment outside. Then he released the case. No one struck anyone. Not a single blow was thrown inside that warehouse. The 2 men who had changed their positions escorted Emery to the car, gently, in exactly the way people led away someone who had just lost everything. Cassius crossed the warehouse floor toward Noel. He didn't touch her. He stopped at a respectful distance and said he was sorry for believing the worst of her, even if only for 30 seconds. Noel looked at him, at the dark circles beneath his eyes after 3 sleepless nights, then said she could forgive 30 seconds. What she couldn't yet forgive were all those weeks. She said they would deal with that later. For now, he needed to get her out of there. The gathering was called on Saturday evening, in the private dining room behind an old restaurant in Bensonhurst, a room containing only a long table, walls paneled in dark wood, and a single door. Don Aldo Bracchi sat at the head of the table, a man in his 70s with both hands folded upon the wooden surface, and he didn't speak a single word during the first half hour. Emery spoke first. He didn't mention the warehouse or the car. He presented only one fact, and he presented it skillfully. He said his younger cousin had sat down with another family to ask the price of a way out. He said that when a leader began asking how to withdraw, he was no longer a leader. Then Emery spoke about Cassius's health. He said everyone in the family knew Cassius hadn't been able to sleep properly for years, that he cared deeply for his cousin. But compassion was compassion, and that seat wasn't meant for a man in such a condition. Murmurs moved along the table. Cassius didn't argue with a single word. He didn't deny the meeting in Bensonhurst, or the sleepless nights. He simply stood and asked Don Aldo for permission to invoke an old law, stating that the accused had the right to bring into the room one witness who owed him nothing. Nearly everyone at the table objected at once. One man said no one had invoked that law since their father's generation. Another asked bluntly whom Cassius intended to bring inside. Don Aldo struck one knuckle against the table exactly once. The room fell silent. He said an old law was still the law, then ordered someone to open the door. Noelle Draper entered the private dining room behind that restaurant wearing her gray sweater, worn through at both elbows, and walked past more than a dozen watching eyes toward the empty chair in the middle of the table. She placed her hardbound notebook with its worn corners on the wooden surface. Then she said the first thing, and it wasn't what anyone expected. She said everything, mister. Emery had just said about Cassius's health was true. She opened the notebook and began to read without omitting or softening anything. She read about the nights when he hadn't slept for even 1 minute. She read about the episodes at 3 o'clock in the morning, how long they lasted, and whether he had managed to lie down again afterward. She read every detail of the worst week without removing a single word. Everyone at the table listened, and Emery leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man whose work was being done for him, Then Noelle turned to the later pages of the notebook. She said she was a nurse, and nurses recorded everything that happened around an event, even the details that seemed entirely unrelated. She read the arrival and departure times of every person who had entered that floor, night after night. She read the entry from the night when 2 sets of headlights changed lanes inside the battery tunnel, including the exact time, then named the 3 people who had known the route that evening, 2 of whom had been inside the car. She read every occasion when Mr. Emery had entered the floor, then read one date that matched another date inside the brown file that had been lying on the table since the hearing began. She closed the notebook. She said that if they wanted to know whether Cassius was weak, she had already answered them. Yes, he was. Everything was recorded inside those pages, without a single night missing. But they were judging the wrong question. The question wasn't whether he was weak. The question was what a weak man did to those weaker than himself. Then she added that throughout all those nights, she hadn't seen Cassius turn his anger against someone weaker than he was, not even once. No one in the room spoke. Don Aldo studied Emery for a very long time, then delivered his judgment in 3 short sentences. Emery Marchetti's name was stricken from the 5 families. All his territory was taken from him. Beginning the following morning, no one in the city would owe him anything. It was the harshest sentence that table could pronounce, and it didn't require a single hand to be raised against him. Cassius didn't reveal Desmond Payne's name. No one asked, and he didn't speak it. Before everyone stood to leave, Cassius requested permission to say one final thing. He said he still wanted that way out, and he agreed to pay the price he had been given in Bensonhurst. All his territory would be returned to the remaining 4 families. He would keep the transportation company and several buildings. He surrendered exactly half of everything he owned, and he signed the agreement that very evening upon the same long table. The following morning, Noelle went down to the kitchen earlier than usual, and found Bernadette Lang already sitting at the small table in the corner, with 2 cups of tea before her, one placed on the opposite side as though she had been waiting for someone for a long time. She told Noelle to sit down. Then she said there was something she should have told her on that first night by the elevator, and she had remained silent throughout all those months because she hadn't known where to begin. She placed her hands on the table, the hands of a woman who had spent her entire life standing inside houses that didn't belong to her, and began to tell the story. She said she was the person who had brought Noelle's mother into this house. The mistress of the house had been very weak by then. One nurse after another had been replaced, and none of them remained for more than a few weeks. So Bernadette had asked everyone she knew, until an acquaintance recommended a woman named Colleen Draper. Bernadette had made the telephone call. She had opened the door when Noelle's mother entered that entrance hall of dark stone for the first time. The 2 women had worked beneath the same roof throughout the final months of the mistress's life, sharing shifts, sharing the long nights, and eating together at the very same little table in the corner of the kitchen where Bernadette and Noelle now sat. Bernadette said she had never known anyone who performed that work the way Noelle's mother did. Other people completed their duties and left. Her mother stayed. Bernadette said there were nights when she passed the bedroom door and heard singing from inside, and she would stand in the corridor for a while before moving on because she felt she shouldn't intrude upon that place. Then the mistress died. Colleen Draper left and began working for another household. That was the ordinary course of such work. People moved from one house to the next, and no one remained in contact. Bernadette said she had intended to call. She said it twice. She had intended to call during the holidays, then decided against it. She meant to call again the following summer, then stopped herself because Colleen still had to work and had 2 young children, and Bernadette thought a call would only disturb her. She hadn't known Colleen had fallen ill. She hadn't known when it happened. She learned only much later, by chance, through someone they had both known, and by then, everything had already been over for a long time. She hadn't been able to attend the funeral. She hadn't even sent a single flower. Her voice remained steady, but she had to stop there and look out the window for a while. Noelle didn't say anything. She only pushed the cup of tea toward her. Bernadette continued. She said that on the day Mr. Payne gave her the list of candidates submitted by the care company, he had asked her to review it first because she managed the household. She read from the top of the page to the bottom. Near the end, she saw that surname. She said she had held the list for a very long time. Then she took a pen and crossed out every other name. Those people hadn't been unqualified. Some held far more impressive credentials, while others had spent many more years doing the work. Bernadette crossed out their names because she had been searching for one particular surname, and she didn't intend to let it slip away a second time. Noelle sat without moving. Throughout all those months, she had believed she entered this house because she was cheap, because she had nowhere else to turn, and because they had run out of people to call. Bernadette looked at her and said something Noelle would remember for the rest of her life. She said she hadn't chosen Noelle out of pity. She had chosen her because Noelle's mother was the only person in that house it ever asked whether Bernadette was tired that day. During 40 years of domestic service, only one person had asked her that question. Then Bernadette lifted her tea with both hands and added that she had promised herself she would repay that kindness if the opportunity ever came, and she had never imagined it would come so late. Noelle reached across the table and took Bernadette's hand. Outside, morning had fully arrived, and inside the kitchen, only 2 women remained, sitting silently beside 2 cups of tea that had gone cold. 1 year later, on the ground floor of an old building in Sunset Park, a small sign bore the name Colleen Draper, with the words Home Health Care written beneath it, free of charge for families who couldn't afford to pay. Bernadette Lang ran the center. She arrived before 7 o'clock every morning, dressed in a neat coat with her hair gathered into a low bun, and she remembered the names of every nurse, as well as the names of their husbands and children. Mornings in the waiting room were always cheerful, filled with greetings and laughter, and the young son of one nurse often stood by the door, waving goodbye whenever the women picked up their medical bags and left for work. The first instruction Bernadette gave every new employee was always a simple one. When you enter someone's home, don't hurry merely to finish the work. Stay a little longer and ask how they are feeling that day. As for Ellis, what happened wasn't anything the brother and sister had imagined. When Emery Marchetti was stripped of his name and lost his seat on the hospital board, every place he had used as something to barter was reviewed, and Ellis Draper's application was returned to the position where it should have been from the beginning. He entered the program according to its medical criteria. No one intervened on his behalf, and no one paid for his place. The door that had remained closed before the brother and sister for all those months had never truly been locked. There had only been someone sitting in front of it, blocking the way. By spring, Noelle received a video Ellis had recorded himself using his phone, with the cracked screen, propped upright on a chair in the center's corridor. In the video, he gripped the rehabilitation frame, rose to his feet, and walked. He counted every step aloud, his voice echoing through the corridor, and when he reached the final step, he laughed loudly before collapsing back into the chair, gasping for breath, and still laughing. Noelle watched the video more times than she could count, and every time, she watched it all the way to the end, including the final part that showed nothing but the ceiling. That autumn, she returned to school to complete the final year she had abandoned many years earlier. She traveled to class by train like everyone else, and spent her free evenings doing assignments at the kitchen table. Desmond Payne had left the city on the night of the confrontation in Red Hook. No one ever saw him again. There had been no farewell, and no one was sent to find him. In the private dining room behind the old restaurant that evening, one name had remained unspoken, and that silence was all a man could be given after so many years. Cassius Marchetti now ran a maritime transportation company and several buildings, signing documents inside an office with its windows wide open, and most of the people who had known him before no longer called. He had lost exactly half of everything he owned, and he never once said that he regretted it. On an ordinary evening in October, while a light rain fell outside and the house remained warm, Cassius and Noelle sat together on the sofa in the living room, with only one lamp burning in the far corner. Noelle was halfway through a chapter in one of her textbooks. After a while, she realized that the sound of his breathing beside her had changed, becoming slower, deeper, and steady. He had fallen asleep with his head resting against her shoulder and one hand lying loosely across his knee. She didn't move. Very gently, she took the thin blanket from the back of the sofa and drew it over him. Then she remained there in the darkness, awake, and didn't mind in the slightest. This story leaves us with 3 very simple truths. The respect a person deserves doesn't depend upon the work they do, and anyone who judges another human being by the shoes they wear will sooner or later judge them wrongly. Kindness doesn't disappear. It merely waits to be remembered, and sometimes an entire generation must pass before someone remembers it. And no one in this world is so strong that they don't need care, just as no one is so poor that they have nothing left to give. If this story touched your heart, please click like and share it, so that others may hear it as well. Please subscribe to our channel, so that every day we can bring you more warm and moving stories like this one. And whatever you felt about Noelle, about Bernadette, and about that man, please leave a few words in the comments. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.